And it doesn't look full screen to me yet. I'm not sure why.
Okay, it does to me.
Okay.
Let me just grab something.
Okay.
Okay. You need to get some water.
Yes.
So just let me know when to start.
Okay. I think I'll
I
give it a
don't see
few.
anything.
Yeah, I think I'll give it a few more minutes. I'm not
Okay.
entirely sure where on the screen I get to see how many people have joined us.
Oh, okay. All right.
So if you have joined us and you want to put hello in the chat, that would be great. Who you are and where you are from. Have you been listening to the other sessions?
I have, yeah.
Yeah, so it's been back to back. So
Oh, yeah.
so yeah. I don't know if the 1 o'clock is some of the 1 o'clocks are running late, but
Oh, all right. Okay. I'll do my best with English.
oh
It's not my first language, but
yeah, no, it's hard. Good for you for trying. Okay, it's 2 o'clock exactly right now. Do you want to give it 2 more minutes?
sure.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We'll get ready to go in a few more seconds. We're here with Florence Gasparini, Lorette, and
Exactly.
and we're looking forward to her presentation. If you'd like to say hello in the chat and where you're joining us from, that would be great. And you can put questions there, and I will help Florence by voicing them towards the end of our program. Okay, I think we'll get going here, everyone. My name is Kristen Lays, and I'm the Executive Director at Belle Grove Plantation in Middletown, Virginia. That's in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. And we have been so fortunate to work with the Slave Dwelling Project a number of times. We've hosted several sleepovers and even some school programs, worked with some college classes and even high school classes, coming to do an overnight with Joe here at Belle Grove. And just love the connections that we get to make through this project. So we're so happy to introduce Florence Gasparini Lorette, joining us from the University of Paris. And we welcome her. And I'd be so interested, Florence, to learn how you know of the Slave Dwelling Project in addition to your background. So I'll turn it over to you for your presentation.
All right, thanks a lot. So I'm Florence, I'm French. I'm a PhD candidate in the University of Paris 8, which is located in the north of Paris, and I work on the Huguenot heritage. So I'm going to give you a quick presentation of my dissertation. I study Huguenot heritage in Florida, New York, and South Carolina. And I'm looking at the way the old Huguenot colonies became touristic sites and how some of them were transformed into museums or national memorials. My work also aims at studying the way the narratives of the slaves who lived in the Huguenot colonies are told to the visitor on the present days. I'm looking at the evolution of these narratives, how this type of tourism is now on a rise, and why it is appealing to tourists. And my goal is to explain how slave heritage tourism is now part of the tourism industry in the United States through the study of different types of historic sites. So I'm going to talk to you about different sites that I study for my dissertation. And excuse me if I don't pronounce things correctly sometimes, if I mispronounce names. So first of all, I'm going to talk to you about the Huguenots and the ways they use slavery in their colonies. And I'm going to give you two examples of different sites that I'm studying for my research, which used slavery. So first of all, who were the Huguenots? They were French Protestants. They were followers of Jean Calvin. And they have a very strong history with colonial America, and I'm going to explain to you why. So the Huguenots first came to America in 1562. They came to Florida near the present Jacksonville area, and they also went to Paris Island in South Carolina. They built a first fort there called Shalford on Paris. This colony didn't last, and then they later came back to Florida and they built Fort Caroline, which is now a national memorial. And this site was destroyed by the Spanish in 1565 because most of the Huguenots were massacred by the Spanish because they were Protestants. So, as you may know, the Protestants were massacred during the Saint Bartholomew Day in 1572. So that happened in Paris. That started in Paris and then went through France. A bunch of people were killed on that night and day. After that, Huguenots couldn't stay in the kingdom. If they wanted to continue their religion, they had to leave because of the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685. So a lot of them actually left France. About 200,000 escaped France, and some of them moved to the American colonies. So the Huguenots, they didn't own slaves in France or in the European countries where they were refugees. They only started to use slavery when they moved to America. And I know it seems very hard to understand why people who were themselves persecuted in their own country would choose to turn other people into labor. And if you look at other European communities like the Amish, the Mennonites, the Quakers, they were also persecuted in Europe. When they came to America, they didn't use slavery. So that's a question that I ask myself: why did some of them use slavery? So let's see examples of colonies who use slavery in South Carolina. For example, you have the Beaufort town, which is located in the south of South Carolina, and the Hampton plantation. So in these colonies, they had a use of slavery. And then also,
Florence, I'm sorry to
yes?
interrupt you, Florence. Are you advancing your slides? Because we're not seeing that.
Oh, yeah, I am.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah, I don't know why, but we're not seeing those advance.
I'll go back.
Okay.
You're only seeing.
Yeah, the first one and then thumbnails of the other ones.
Okay. If I do it like this, can you see it?
Yes, we're getting
Okay.
there. Yeah, keep going.
Okay, so let me back up.
Okay.
So as I was saying, this was the, can you see it?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So this was the first Huguenot colony in America, located in Florida, Fort Caroline. This is now a national memorial. And I mentioned the massacre of the Saint-Barthélemy. And then I mentioned the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685. That's when the Huguenots couldn't continue their religion. They had to flee France, and some of them came to America for that reason. So I was showing two photos of two Huguenot colonies, which are located in South Carolina, Beaufort and Hampton Plantation. And both those colonies, they did use slavery. And the next one are two colonies where they didn't use slavery. I was really trying to understand why some colonies, Huguenot colonies, would use slavery and wouldn't. And I realized that it was, because most of the time they used slavery to make profits. And that's why I wanted to study two good examples of Huguenot colonies where slavery was largely used to understand how they decided to start it and make profits with it. So my first example is about Falls, which is located in the state of New York. So it is a Huguenot colony. It was founded in 1678 by 12 Huguenots, and they all came from the same area, the north of France. And Louis Dubois, the one who was the founder of the colony, he was a refugee in Germany, and then he came to America with his family. And today, this site is owned by the historic Huguenot Street, which was founded in 1894. So I did two internships at this historic Huguenot Street. The first one was in 2006, and the second one was in 2012. And I noticed a very big difference between these two experiences. The first time I was there, no one mentioned slavery in the colony. But when I came back in 2012, it was a big subject of research. So in 6 years, a lot of things changed at this specific site, and they started to research slavery that took place in the colony. So the slaves who lived in this Huguenot colony, we know a few things about them. We know that Louis Dubois, which was the founder, he had two slaves. He bought them at an auction in Kingston in 1674, and they are both mentioned in his will. We know that in this specific house, the Hasbrook house, 4 slaves lived in the cellar of this house. But as you can see, there is no mention of these slaves on the historical marker, which is located in front of the house. It's because this historical marker was done in 1935, and they didn't talk about preservation of slavery at that time. So this site, it's now a museum, and there is a document there which is exposed at the historic Huguenot Street. It's a piece of archive, and it's a table with the numbers of slaves and their identities, the identities of their mothers, and it's from 1775. And for example, you learn a few informations on the slave. You learn that Daniel Hasbrook had 2 male slaves and 2 female slaves, and that Simon Dubois had 3 male slaves and 3 female slaves. But we don't know their names, their first name or date of birth or any kind of information, only their owner's name. So for my research, I looked into different books who mention slavery in the Huguenot colonies. One of the books that I looked into was published in 2009. It's called For the Village, The Story of Huguenot Street. And there is a short piece of information on slavery. It says that in 1790, 77 families owned a total of 302 slaves. So it is just a quick mention of slaves in the colony. I looked at another book called Huguenot Refugee in Colonial New York, and this one was published in 2005. It does have a chapter on slavery. It's called Masters and Slave, but most of the book is on the Huguenot families who lived in the colony. I also want to mention that Sojourner Truth lived in the Hudson Valley, and she gave a testimony on the way slaves lived and worked in the New Paltz area. So she was a big influence in the Hudson Valley, especially in New Paltz. And now, if you go to the SUNY University, which is the local university, there is a Sojourner Truth library, which is opened. And in 2019, the university decided to change the name of some of the buildings. They were named after the Huguenot settlers, and they changed their names to names related to Native American culture. So we see that there is an evolution on the way the colony works. Before, they only talked about the white settlers, but now they mentioned slaves and native people who lived in the area. So how are they honored today at the historic Huguenot Street, and how did the preservation of their memory start, and why, and what is done today to remember them? So if you look at the website of the historic Huguenot Street, it says now that it is a multicultural story. So it's not only a story about French people who came to America to escape persecution. It's a story about Native American, French people, Dutch people, and African people. And in 2016, they did an exhibit on slavery at the historic Huguenot Street. They also had the slave dwelling project, which came to New Paltz to spend the night in the cellar kitchen of the house I mentioned before. Then in 2017, there was a focus on John Hasbrook at the Visitor Center of the Dubois Fort, which is part of the historic Huguenot Street. This exhibition was called John Hasbrook, a most estimated citizen. So this man was born from an enslaved woman in 1806. He was freed, and then he became the first African American to vote in New Paltz. And in this exhibit, you can see some of his personal objects. The historic Huguenot Street also participates in the Old Stone Day. The last one took place in 2012. So it's an annual tradition which started in the 50s. It was started as a fundraiser by the Reformed Church of New Paltz to help with the preservation of the colonial houses. And it would stop in 2009 and started again in 2012. So this time they changed the way they did it. They decided to focus on the diversity of the Hudson Valley history. So they didn't only focus on the Huguenot settlers. They wanted to show the impact of African culture in the area. So, for example, there was a demonstration of traditional cooking to show how the enslaved African cooked over a fire. And in the Juneteenth 2021, there was a celebration in New Paltz, and there was a dedication in honor of Julia Jackson. She was the last surviving enslaved woman to live in New Paltz. Another example of preservation is a commemorative event which took place at the historic cemetery. So this Huguenot cemetery is where some of the founders are buried. And in 1894, when they were doing some digging around one of the colonial houses, a skull was found, and this skull belonged to a male slave. It was found near one of the houses, and they kept it with the archive, but they couldn't identify it. So in 2013, they held a ceremony at the cemetery to bury the remains of this slave. And you can see the photo of the memorial headstone for the slaves who lived in the colony. So they are part of the cemetery now. It's not only the white settlers who are located in the cemetery. Okay, I'm gonna move to the other side that I want to talk about. So the other site is located in South Carolina. It is the Hanover House, and this house was built for a Huguenot, and his name was Saint-Julien. So when they built the house, it was part of the plantation. And Saint-Julien, when he died, we know that 45 slaves live in the house. We know their first names. And when they started preserving the house, most of the work was done by the colonial dames, which is an association for wealthy women. And when they did their research, they only looked at the family members, the Ravenel family, which was a very powerful family in South Carolina. So they decorated the house with their portraits. So it was kind of white-only preservation work, and no one mentioned the slaves who lived in the house. Then the house opened as a museum in 1962. There was a historical marker who was set up by the house, but then again, no mention of the slaves who lived in the house. But when they opened the house later as a museum, they added some pieces related to the slaves who lived in the house on this plantation. So here is a sign of the names of the people who lived in the plantation when Saint-Julien died. So you can see all the name of the slaves who were part of that plantation. Also, there is a room called the Master's Room, and there you can see a tool which was by the slave in this house. So it's another part of the artifacts that you can see which is related to slavery. And when you tour the house, you have some informations. They give you like brochures. And one of the brochure was made for children. And there is a full on slavery. So it's a small guide which is distributed to children. And it explains to children how slaves were divided into men and women for work and what were their tasks. And this brochure was done by the Clemson University. So Clemson University also owns the Fort Hill plantation site. Dr. Thomas mentioned it earlier. She gave a presentation about the work that they are doing there. As you can see, my dissertation is about Huguenot colonies in 3 American states, because I'm also working, as you can see, on Florida. But I'm not only looking at the way French settlers came and settled into the Americans' colonies and how their memories preserved. I'm also looking at the way the other people who were part of their experience lived and the way they are preserved. That's why I want to focus my study on the slaves who live in these colonies, but also on the native people who were in the area during the time that they settled. Do you have any questions? And thank you for your time.
Thank you. Feel free to put questions in the chat. On my presenter side, I'm not sure if people can unmute themselves or not. So, but if you put something in the chat, then I'd be happy to let Florence know about them. One of our people on the call is Kathy, and she has a Huguenot ancestor in New York, and one was killed in the 1712 slave rebellion.
Right.
Do you want to tell us a little more about that history? Are you aware of that history? I'm not.
It's not part of my research, but I do see a question from Lee Guillon, and his ancestor was in New Rochelle, and New Rochelle is part of my research. It is a colony which is located in New York, and I do study the preservation of New Rochelle. So I have a chapter in my dissertation about this specific colony.
So you had said one of the things that inspired your research was to understand how people who were refugees themselves and persecuted themselves might be interested in being slave owners. Would you have any suggestions on why that might be the case?
Well, according to what I found out, it was mainly a question of profits. And if you look at some of the colonies where they didn't use slavery, for example, Pearisburg, which was a very small colony in the south of South Carolina, at that time when they lived in these colonies, they didn't use slavery, but their descendants moved to Beaufort and then they started to use slavery. So I was wondering if, they had like a question of like the Amish or the Mennonites or the Quakers, they knew, they mentioned that they were against slavery, but the Huguenots never really mentioned anything about it. And I think it's also because the Huguenots, they really try to settle and become Americans. So some of them didn't even want in Huguenot colonies anymore. They went to Charleston or they stayed in New York and they switched French to English and they started to adapt their religion and their culture to the their new country. So they took some of their bad habits too, and to become more American, to become richer, they started to use enslaved labor. I think that's the main reason.
Yes, so Lee wanted to know why you chose the Huguenot colonies over others. What connected you to the Huguenots?
So I to do my research when I did my first internship. I didn't know much about the Huguenots when I got there. The first time was many years ago and but I didn't know much about my ancestors. I did my first internship at the History Street, and I fell in love with the story of the Huguenots who came to the New World. And I did my memoir for my master's degree on this colony, and then I a master's degree in history, and I did to do it on Fort Caroline, which was the first colony. And when I had the opportunity to move on and go on and do a PhD, I decided to choose 3 states, Florida, South Carolina, and New York. I couldn't choose more states because it would be way too much work. These specific colonies that I choose them because they have some materials, ruins, or sites that you can visit. For example, they have churches, houses, plantations, graves, and some of the other colonies, they don't even have a single thing. So I work on colonial tourism as well. So I needed to have colonies where you could actually go and visit and experience something. So
That's great. So you didn't get into, in this presentation, you didn't get into your research about Florida, but
yeah,
did the Huguenot colonies there use enslaved labor?
no,
Catherine
no,
did that
no, they
question.
didn't, because it was way earlier in
I see.
1562, but they did have some interactions with the Native Americans. And at the beginning, these meetings that they had with them were very friendly, and the Native American helped them when they settled in the Jacksonville area. And then some tension started between them, and these tensions led to violent acts. So they didn't use slavery. Can you still? Yeah, I'm back. So they didn't use slavery because it didn't. They didn't have the possibility to do it. Slaves were not brought to America yet, but they did have some abuse towards Native Americans.
And then Sarah had a question,
Mm-hmm.
and you may not be able to answer it, but the French colonists that went into Canada, was slavery a part of their cultural experience?
So the Huguenots didn't go to Canada because they were Catholic people in Canada. The French who lived in Canada were Catholic, so Huguenots couldn't go there. And when some of the Huguenots, they went to the French Indies, and they used slavery there because they had plantations, so slaves work on their plantations, but they were expelled from the French Indies when the revocation of the Edict of Nantes started, because you had to be Catholic to stay there. You know, even though it wasn't in France, it was a colony, you had to be Catholic. So they were expelled from these colonies. They had to go back to France, and then they moved to Americas. And some of them who started using slave in the West Indies, you know, gave some informations through letters and meetings to some of the people who settled in New Paltz. So they explained them how to use labor, you know, to get rich, and, you know, how to create a wealthy lifestyle. And about Canada, I don't really know because my research isn't focused on Canada at all.
Thank you. We still have some time, so if you have more questions, please go right ahead. And Florence, I'm not entirely sure how the chat gets saved, but Lee Guillaume is happy to
Yeah,
connect with you. So I
Yeah,
put that down. So
I saw that.
good.
Um,
Yeah,
I
I
went
copied.
to a very small cemetery in Louisiana, and there was a Guillaume grave there. So I don't know if he knows about it, but one of his ancestors is buried in Louisiana.
So I'm just curious. So you mentioned the Huguenots had an interest in assimilating into American
Yes.
culture as the country was growing. Did their cultural identity last many generations, or did that start to dissipate?
It really depends on the colony. If you
Mhm.
look at New Poles, for example, the first generation, the second generation, they spoke French. They taught their children French. They had like French teachers. They kept their religious way. But then a lot of Dutch settlers lived in the area, and they started to marry, into other communities, and they started to adapt to their culture and language. They started to speak Dutch. They switched to the Reform religion. So they adapted themselves, and they didn't preserve their Frenchness for a very long time. If you look at very, very small colonies like New Bordeaux, which was a tiny group of people, they were in a very remote area surrounded by woods. So they didn't have a lot of interaction with other people. So they kept their language, but their colony was so secluded, and they wanted to grow grapes. It didn't really work, so the colony was abandoned. So if they lived in like a remote area, it was much easier to preserve their Frenchness. But the one who lived in Charleston, for example, or New York, they spoke English.
Um, so so I know in so many of these sessions or so many of our sites who are trying to change the narrative, the sites that you've been working with, have they struggled with doing that? And what has the reaction from the public been?
In New Poles, they got the help of the SUNY University, which has a program on African American history. So the students, for example, who study African American history, they can do internships at New Poles. So there is a partnership between the two. And now when they give their tours, for example, include the history of the slaves. And that was not the case, back a few years ago. So I saw an evolution on that matter, especially when I got there the first time and I heard nothing about slaves who lived there. I didn't know that slaves lived in this colony. In the colonies of South Carolina, for example, I visited the Hampton Plantation, and it is now a state historic site. And when I got there, there was a part who mentioned slavery. You could like the slave quarters, for example. So it is shown in the tour that slave people lived in this colony on this plantation. So it is mentioned. And to me, it really depends on the type of sites that you visit. Some of the sites that are preserved by the National Park Service, for example, they tend to be more aware of Black history, and they, express that to their visitors.
Has there been any pushback from visitors coming, thinking they're coming to learn about people that are Europeans that came to this country and were refugees and made the whole immigrant mythology?
I don't think so. Nowadays, I've never noticed anything about it, but back in like 100 years ago, for example, in the high society of New York City, being a descendant from a Huguenot was like a huge thing. They even call it like the Huguenot race. So because you were a descendant of French people, you were like some kind of noble person, even though your ancestor was a person who was persecuted and maybe didn't even have a lot of money. And he probably came to America as a poor man. But they felt that this Frenchness was something very, that you wanted to show off that you were a descendant.
Yeah, refined.
Yeah, exactly.
Background. Yeah, yeah.
And it's very funny because, for example, if you look at new polls on the houses that are preserved, they were restored, but many years ago. And there is some of them have signs of La Fleur de Lis, the king's flower. And it's even the case in New Rochelle, for example. They use that sign, but the Huguenots wouldn't use or consider that sign because they didn't want to live in their country anymore. The king was trying to kill them. So, being French, I guess it's still seen as something great, I guess, in America, but especially at that time when the preservation movement started. So in the 1920s, 1930s, it was a very big thing.
Yeah, I can imagine that. Yeah. So it's interesting because we're talking a lot about the lost cause mythology and romanticism of the Old South. But the same thing can happen with, French culture, European, Old World European culture.
Exactly.
That's rosy glow of history. Okay. Well, any more questions for Florence in the chat? And then I guess I think there's a 3:00 session too. So then maybe we all get a little bit of a break.
But and it's nighttime for me in France. Yeah, it is nighttime. It's later at night. It's almost 9:00.
9:00 your time. Yeah. Well, we appreciate you joining us very much and very fascinating. Are you coming back to the United States to do any more research?
I'm actually waiting on the borders to open so I can travel back. I was supposed to do more research in New York and New York City. Last time I was in America, I did a full tour of South Carolina, and I was able to get a lot of archives there. So that was a very good experience. I'm missing a part of my archives to finish my dissertation. It's been complicated to, work on your research when you're missing archives. Very complicated. Yes. So I lost some time not being able to travel to the US.
Right. What do you do in France? You're just a full-time student, or do you lecture?
No, I organize political events.
Oh, okay.
No connection to my research at all.
No connection, but pays the bills, right?
Yeah. Very different.
Yeah, good. Well, it was lovely to meet you and work with you. And let's see, I don't just get this scrolling there. So you have a nice bon merci for you.
Oh, yeah.
And
merci.
And yes, and several people on the chat with the Huguenot ancestry too.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah.
See, a lot of American people are descendants from the French people.
Yeah. Wonderful.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for having me. It was a pleasure to be part of the event, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you so much. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye. Bye.
Bye.